Thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today we're beginning a two-part episode with our friend and scholar, Dr. Craig Evans of Houston Baptist University. He's here to talk about his book, Jesus and the Manuscripts, what we can learn from the oldest texts. Dr. Evans joins us today from Texas to tell us all about early evidence for Christianity and the preservation and transmission of the New Testament. Dr. Evans, welcome back to Digging for Truth. It's good to see you again.
Good to be back.
It's great to have you. You've been on the show before. We've talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had another episode before where we talked about New Testament manuscripts, and we're going to sort of talk about some of those subjects today a little bit more, but we're going to add a lot more to it because you have a book out, Jesus and the Manuscripts. Love the title. Fantastic book. I spent a lot of time reading through it. I enjoyed it, and we're hoping our audience will do the same. So let's get into it because we're doing two parts today. I thought maybe we'd start with, in the beginning of your book, you talk about what your overarching purpose is. You kind of give like 3 big points of what you're trying to accomplish. Maybe you could start with that, Dr. Evans, if you could, please.
I'm concerned that many people who take the Bible seriously, and especially Jesus and the Gospels, are not aware of the nature of the literature itself. That they don't have a good grasp of the manuscripts of the Gospels and other New Testament writings, how many we have, how old they are, how good they are. And they're unaware of how Jesus, in fact, appears in a variety of other traditions. They can be Christian within the church, but also traditions outside Christendom, such as in the Quran, in rabbinic literature, and in other sources. They're unaware that Jesus' name is invoked in magical texts, for example, for protection and healing and so on. So there's a lot of literature out there, and some of it is very technical and hard to get into. So I wanted to write for 2 audiences. I know it's a bit over the head of some popular readers, but every time Greek is used or Latin or Hebrew or something like that, it's always translated. So You shouldn't be put off. You can access it. But I'm thinking of the scholar too. There are a lot of scholars out there that don't know a lot of this stuff. And I wanted to help everybody on both sides of it, the scholars and non-experts alike, and just review all of the literature from antiquity that I think is really important, that says something about the Jesus of history.
Yeah, it's tremendous. That's exactly the sense you get into. When I was reading through the book, I felt there's depth there, but I could come out and go back in. And then if I wanted to go deeper into something, the footnotes are copious in the bibliography. So it really does serve both purposes. And I think that's important. I like the way you survey sort of aspects of debate and sort of help people critically assess how the evidence is ignored or abused and that sort of thing. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, yes, and this happens on all sides. People who take Scripture very seriously, they believe that the Bible is truth and read it accordingly, and yet there's a lot of naivete and misunderstanding of how the Bible came about, the text of the Bible, just a failure to understand the whole dynamics of handwritten manuscripts. And of course, skeptics, they're even worse. They don't know where the Bible came from, what went into the canon. They fall for ridiculous popular ideas like, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, that Emperor Constantine is the one who chose the Gospels, for example.
Yes.
Or some of the extreme stuff that we see in Bart Ehrman, who does know better, but was in popular writing suggesting that who knows how the text originally read. There are so many mistakes and so many changes. Nobody really knows how the Greek New Testament originally read. The Gospels have been changed and all the rest of that. There's a lot of stuff that really is nonsense on a popular level, but even in the scholarly circles, a lack of understanding. And so you get these crazy claims, and there's just no truth to them. And so I thought, okay, I don't want the book to be simply popular and fluffy. A lot of people can do that and say you can trust the Bible, it's true, or it's historical. I wanted to get into the really serious academic side to it, because if we don't convince the professors and the teachers, then there's not going to be much of an improvement in the situation. And I have received some wonderful emails from people, some I know, some I don't, saying, I didn't know that before.
Yes.
Like even in reference to the introduction, no idea what Papias actually was saying in the early second century about how the Gospels got written. I wanted to revisit that. There are new manuscripts available that scholars don't even know about that have relevance for understanding how history was written, how the ancients understood that, and how this makes sense of what the church fathers in the second century were saying. So it was really, I had to just start at the foundation and work my way up.
I think part of what I hear you saying, I wasn't going to ask you this, but it just really occurred to me very strongly that your book would be a great tool for the pastor who wants to seriously understand the preservation of Christianity in the earliest texts, church fathers and manuscripts themselves. Maybe you could comment on that a little bit, speak to the pastoral end of this and how this could be used for pastoral ministry.
Oh, gladly. Thanks for asking, Henry. I was so disappointed when, in the aftermath of Bart Ehrman's popular book, Misquoting Jesus, hearing anecdotally mostly stories about people quitting the ministry because they no longer had confidence that the New Testament text could be trusted, or the Gospels have been garbled and who knows really what Jesus said or did. There is no excuse for that. That is wrong. And Bart Ehrman, of course, knows that. Real scholars know that. How can the pastors be, many pastors be in the dark like that? So I'm really hoping that clergy, I know they're busy and they've got a lot going on, but they need to know the issues better. And they're there, the data, the proof, the evidence, it's all there. And I pull it together in the covers of one book, and you can look at all of it. You don't need to be confused when somebody says, well, the real Jesus is in the Quran or in the Talmud, or there's some evidence out there, or the papyri. It's all there, and you can review it and see that, hey, you have every reason to have confidence in the Gospels. The text has been preserved, and what Jesus really taught and said and so on and did, it's in the Gospels. But you now have the information, and so you know that with conviction, and you can teach your congregations that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we're here with Dr. Craig Evans talking about his book, Jesus and the Manuscripts. We do recommend this for pastors. This book can be purchased on the ABR website. And with that thought, we'll be right back, folks, after a brief message. Don't go away.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here today with Dr. Craig Evans. We're talking about the early New Testament manuscripts that are preserved and other evidence related to it. Now, I want to share with you a couple of resources really quick before we get back to Dr. Evans. First is his book, Jesus and the Manuscripts. We highly recommend this, especially if you want to plumb the depths. We recommend it for pastors. For someone who's new to the subject, Dr. Evans was in a film called Fragments of Truth. You can get this online, and we'll put up information about that. This gives beautiful pictures and an overview of what we're talking about here today. We highly recommend this resource and episode 29 of Digging for Truth, where Dr. Evans was on with us previously. Now, we're done with the commercial, Dr. Evans. We want to let people know about that. Now we're going to get back into the nitty-gritty, and that is really one of the most interesting parts of what you bring to the table here in this discussion, a lot of what probably a lot of people are not aware of, and that is the the length of time that people would tend to preserve texts in the ancient world. It's really fascinating. I'm going to let you just go ahead and introduce that and go whatever direction you want to go in.
There are two patristic comments that scholars long ago found unbelievable. Tertullian, writing at the end of the 2nd century, around the year 190 or so, he's criticizing heretics who distort and twist what Paul teaches. And he says, look, if you don't believe me, you can look at the originals themselves, which are still in the destination cities where Paul wrote his letters. And he mentions Romans, the Corinthian letters, the Thessalonian letters, and so on. The letters are still there. And the word he uses in this Latin text is authenticae epistolae, which literally means the autographic or original letters. And that really bothered scholars. They thought, how could that be? Paul's letters would be over 100 years old. They'd be 135, 140 years old. Could papyrus letters in antiquity last that long? And another church father, Bishop Peter of Alexandria, writing around the year 300 or so, talked about how it was just miraculous that the original copy of the Gospel of John, the autograph of John, thanks to God's providential care, still existed. And this was after a period of persecution. Well, that would make the original Gospel of John over 200 years old. And so scholars thought, these guys, this must be some kind of puffed up apologetic. How's that possible? Well, we have the ancient writers, pagan writers, talking about autographs of Aristotle that were 250 years old. That's even older. We had other references to old books that were 300, 400, in a few cases even 500 years old. Is this possible? Well, then along came Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, where we started finding thousands and thousands of papyri beginning in the 1890s, right on into the 20th century. And in some cases, whole libraries had been thrown out, all the books together. And because they were in a certain layer that could be dated, and I know, Henry, you and many of your listeners know about archaeology and what's called stratigraphy, where we can date the layers. And here would be a layer in the ground that would date, say, to the 4th century AD, but the manuscripts in the basket of books thrown out dated to the 1st or 2nd century, which means these writings were 200 and 300 years old. We found the same thing at Herculaneum. When Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it cooked a whole bunch of books, turned them into carbon. Yeah, they're very brittle, but with X-ray, we can read them, we can study the handwriting, and we can deduce how old they were when suddenly they were fried in the year 79. And guess what? Some of them are 200 and 300 years old. So we have archaeological evidence and testimony from pagans that supports what the early Christian fathers were saying. This is staggering. This means that the autographs of the New Testament writers, many of them were still in circulation 100, 200 years and venerated, studied, copied by early Christian pastors and bishops and so on. And this helps explain why the New Testament text remains stable, which is not the case with other writings that are not as well attested.
Yeah, that's a power-packed argument, and I think in and of itself, I think the church fathers should have been taken more seriously. But I guess one could try to say, well, that's apologetic puff, like you said. They're just trying to make a point. You don't really know that, Tertullian. But now, what you've brought here is this matrix of evidence. And as I was reading through your book, the other thing is just people with private libraries would pass them on to their descendants. And these libraries sometimes were several centuries old. So you have, and plus all the examples that you just gave as well as part of this sort of matrix of data. I found it really fascinating. It makes very plausible what Peter and Tertullian had to say.
Absolutely. And the other thing that we need to underscore, the general public just might not understand this or appreciate it. Books are cheap today. you can buy a paperback book brand new for $10.
Yes.
How many of us have purchased books just to read on the airplane as we pass through an airport? I've done that many times. And the book gets read once or twice, the spine cracks, pages loosen up, we throw it away. That was not how books were treated in antiquity. They were dreadfully expensive. And some of these books are, they're made of leather and bound together and so on, dreadfully expensive. It'd be like buying an automobile. And the idea of just throwing it out. And for early Christians, they venerated the apostles. And the idea that the original Romans or the original Matthew, after a few years, maybe it's getting a little wrinkled, a little dog-eared. Oh, just throw it out in the trash. That is ridiculous. They were, and that's why the church fathers tell us they were venerated, they were treasured and kept for a long time. And it turns out the pagans were the same way.
Yeah.
And they appreciated their great writers and kept their autographs and early copies for centuries.
Yeah, something you point out in the book too, and I'll wrap up this segment, Dr. Evans, we only have a few seconds left, is the stabilizing influence that these autographs would have had. People could have brought their own manuscripts to these churches to double check that, to make sure that there's not a lot of errors introduced. I'll tell you what, I'll give you 20 seconds just to comment on that, if you could, please.
Well, yes, and having an accurate text was very important. In the pagan world, religion tended to be just going through performance and ritual. The pagans recognized Jews and Christians are people of the book. Having the text just right was very important to them.
Yeah. I see, and it makes a lot of sense when you take it into its totality, what I call the matrix of evidence. Well, Dr. Evans, we're on a quick speed here. We're ending up this segment. We're going into segment 3, and we'll be right back after this message.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Craig Evans of Houston Baptist University. We're talking about the earliest witnesses to the Gospels, to the epistles, the letters of the New Testament, and early Christianity. Now, Dr. Evans, we left off our last segment talking about the length of time that people preserve books. Now we're going to shift subjects a little bit. We're going to talk about what might sound strange to some, to others may be familiar. Some of these Gospels that are sort of floating around out there that are not the four, claim to be Gospels. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, and so on. I'd like you to introduce the audience to these works, give them an idea, well, what are they all about? And then in part 2, you and I are going to build on that.
Well, there are basically two types of works that are outside the New Testament. There are types of works that are not controversial. They don't really want to change the image of Jesus that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament, but they just want to extend it. They're interested in Jesus' childhood. They're interested perhaps in some other types of teachings or miracles he may have performed. The Gospel of Peter, for example, it's basically proto-Orthodox. There's nothing really strange about it in terms of teaching, but it's an apologetic. It wants to increase the number of very credible witnesses who see the resurrection. So you have that kind. But the Gospel of Thomas, and especially the overtly Gnostic Gospels, they're interested in introducing brand new teaching, where Jesus begins to teach things that they themselves value, a worldview that they value. The Gnostics believe in two gods, a good God and a bad God. And so, and of course, the good God, you have to reach him not through the cross of Jesus, not through faith in Jesus, but special knowledge he reveals so that you can work your way up through the various layers of heaven and end up in the highest heaven. And so it's this second group that is of special interest because they have, honest to goodness, brand new teachings, strange teachings. And it was with those writings that church fathers like Irenaeus and others wrestled and fought, Tertullian, Origen, and others, because they saw them as a serious threat that would move the church away from a correct understanding of Jesus to heretical ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting in your book when you talk about that. So that gives a good introduction to people, just a generic overview. And Gnosticism, that special knowledge, that knowledge of we have this special knowledge and you don't, it goes totally against the teaching of the gospel. The gospel is for everyone who's willing to welcome it. And so that's one contrast. The other is, I'd like you to comment a little bit about this tendency in academia to try to make these texts earlier and the New Testament later. You mentioned that in your book, and I found that a very interesting phenomenon. It seems very biased to me, but you can comment on that.
Well, of course. And if you're a New Testament scholar, that basically means you work with first century texts. Okay? Well, here's the problem. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they're early. If Thomas is written 120, 150, or as I think, closer to 180, it's not really part of the New Testament. It's much later. It's 2 generations later. It's 2nd century. It's part of church history. Well, if you want to say that the image of Jesus, the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is as valid as the image you have of Jesus in the first century Gospels, you need to make Thomas earlier.
Right.
And you make the canonical Gospels a little later. And the idea is you get everybody sort of at the end of the first century, beginning of the second. And that's egalitarian. Now they're all sort of on, all on the chronologically on the same page.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on. And so you get some of these ideas that don't make any sense, turning a blind eye to obvious 2nd century features. And then, of course, the one that really bothers me is to simply change the evidence. To say, well, yeah, I know we have 3 fragments of Thomas that are in Greek. We have the whole Thomas translated into the Coptic language, the Egyptian language. But what I'm talking about is an hypothetical early form of Thomas that would fit in the first century. Well, nobody knows that that ever existed. And so hypothetical evidence is then taken as gospel, so to speak, and dated to the first century. And there is no evidence of it. It's just the scholar is simply making that up.
Yeah, now that's interesting, that extrapolation that occurs, that presupposition that occurs, that doesn't make its way out into the popular discussion. So, regular people in the church get the impression that there's a basis for this redating or earlier dating. And what I hear you saying is there's really not a basis for it. It's based on scholarly speculations.
Absolutely. There isn't any manuscript evidence that suggests that. In the New Testament manuscripts, you do see the odd thing added to the text hundreds of years later. But the vast majority of the manuscripts we have don't have those things. That's why we can identify them. Well, at least there you have evidence. But in the case of the Gospel of Thomas, we only have what we have, 3 fragments of Greek, and then the one whole of in Coptic, and it dates to the 4th century, by the way. And so how in the world you can extract from that a first century version that you think is just as old as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and therefore contains potentially the authentic Jesus, that is simply special pleading. But what destroys it is no matter what you do with Thomas, and just for fun, I'll sit back and say, okay, strip it down, create what you think is the first century version of it, and I'll show you there's no verisimilitude. There's nothing there that reflects first century Israel. Nothing there that reflects the historical Jesus. And this is why archaeologists never make use of the Gospel of Thomas. They find it of no value. They make use of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Josephus all the time, but they never use Thomas.
Yeah, that's a really good way to end it up. The relationship between the study of the text and the archaeology. Same thing with the book of Acts, first century context. Well, Dr. Evans, we're going to say goodbye for this episode, but I want to thank you for coming on. But you're going to be back for part 2. We're going to talk about the Gospel of Thomas some more, and you're going to demonstrate to folks the arguments that you just made. So thank you very much for being here for part 1. We appreciate it. We're grateful for you.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, don't miss the next episode with Dr. Evans. We're glad that you joined us for part 1. Please join us again for part 2. And thank you for watching Digging for Truth.